Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 157. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're excited to have with us the internationally respected and award-winning Vermont author, Doug Wilhelm.
Thanks, Barney. It's nice of you to say that.
You do have some awards. You got some. It's on your website. You got some pretty fancy awards you got on there too.
Well, yeah, I had a novel that came out in 2019 called Street of Storytellers that won some awards in the world of independently published books. Right. So it was nice to get those awards. It was also the time that the pandemic hit, right when that book was out and those awards were coming in. So it was tough because I had COVID. I was one of the early COVID.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I was an early adopter of COVID. I got it in April of 2020. And that was right when the book had just come out, and then it wins these awards and I can't even leave my room,
right.
So it was kind of a double-edged situation, but it was nice to get that recognition for that book. Yeah.
Right. And that was through their mutual contact through Rootstock Publishing as well. That was published through.
That was a Rootstock book. Yeah. Rootstock,
okay.
Small publisher in Montpelier, the good stuff.
Yeah.
That was a book that I had there's a long story behind that book, and I could bore you through the whole podcast with it. But basically, I had tried, and I have an agent in New York who had really tried to get a major publisher to pick up on that book, and when we couldn't, they just didn't think it was commercial, and Rootstock picked right up on it, and I thought they did a beautiful job. It's a really nicely put together book, really nicely designed. I couldn't have been happier with that process. It's tough with a small publisher to get noticed, which is why those awards, helped.
Right. And that was through, and if I recall correctly from my research, that was based off of your experience in Pakistan in the 80s.
Yeah. So, and I'll try to be really brief with this because, like I said, I could go on forever. But I was a newspaper guy in New Jersey where I'd grown up. I was editing a weekly paper in the late 70s, and I had traveled after college made the old overland trip in the late 70s to from England through Europe, Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan to India and Nepal. And I was gone for about 6 months. And when I came back and got involved in newspaper work, I just really wanted to get back out there, and I wanted to write a book. And so I left after 5 years in the newspapers, and I traveled up through basically from the coast of the Persian Gulf on an old British steamship to Pakistan, and up through Pakistan and way up into Kashmir and Ladakh and beyond the Himalayas. And I was gone a couple of years, and I wrote a nonfiction book about encountering the rise of extremism in Pakistan was basically what it was about. And that book was rejected 75 times. That was my first book. It was never published. And but many years later, I'd been writing young adult novels, and I had a number of young adult novels. So I returned. I still had all my material, a whole banker's box full of notes and notebooks and newspaper clippings and all this stuff. And I did a whole bunch of new research and developed this novel that I aimed at the YA audience.
Right.
I wanted to by that point, I'd been working a lot and doing a lot of school visits, talking a lot with middle school and early high school readers. And I thought a lot of them were really smart and interested in the world. And I wanted to create a story that would put them in another part of the world, in a dangerous place and time, through the eyes of an American teenage narrator. So that's what became of my original book, which came out finally in 2019 as Street of Storytellers.
Right.
That's me telling the story that I could make an hour long, but we don't want to.
Well, so I'm also curious about too, because since you were sitting on that story for a long time, how different did your first draft of that look as compared to what was published?
You mean the first draft of the novel or the very first draft of the original book? Because the original book was a nonfiction book for adults. And so that was very different. I wanted to put my idea was to put myself as a naive Westerner in this world. I did some research, but basically I wanted to go as a sort of, open mind, open eyes, and see what I experienced and try to render it in a way that would be a good story, like
Right.
you'd be making fiction. And that was my idea. I was a very young writer. It was my first book. I was trying to do something kind of large in concept. And I did produce the book. Like I said, it was rejected 75 times. That was a nonfiction book. When I came back many years later to work on this as a novel set in
Right.
West Pakistan, I was able to draw. I looked through all my old notebooks and my book that I'd written originally, and letters that I'd written, and I did pull like descriptions of walking through the bazaar in Peshawar, Pakistan, where this book is set. Some of the characters in the novel are based on people I knew and originally wrote about. I would change things, and some of them are completely made up. So it was a mixture of my own experiences with fiction writing.
Right.
As I mean, most fiction writing is, after all, a mixture of your own reality, your own experiences, and what you can imagine and develop through research. So,
Right.
yeah.
And we're going to talk in a little bit about your latest book, Catalyst for Change. But I'm curious to ask you, as you say, because you cut your teeth before we went on the air. You were talking about how you kind of cut your teeth on writing young adult novels, and how different is the creative process on writing an adult novel as compared to a young adult novel?
Well, I'm writing it, Barney. I've never really written an adult novel. Street of Storytellers. This was my 17th book, and all of them up till then, that were published, were written for young readers, mostly for middle schoolers or YA. This was also aimed at that same audience, but the publisher, Rootstock, thought it would have appeal to adults as well. So they kind of framed it as YA/adult. That was fine with me. Whoever wanted to read it was fine with me. But in the challenges in writing for adolescents, for young adults, is that you're not one of them. It looks like it might be easier because usually the books are not that long unless they're fantasy. I'm a realistic fiction writer, so you got to be around 200 250 pages or they won't publish it, because the idea is that those readers, that age group, won't read a long book unless it's fantasy. But to put yourself in the world and the emotions and the intensity of the experience of being a 7th grader, an 8th grader, a 9th grader is a challenge for sure. And especially in this age where technology and social media is so predominant, something I did not grow up with. And I struggled with that in a couple of the novels I wrote for that audience. And it was really interesting. So I think, one of for me, a relief in writing for adults, because my newest book is nonfiction for adults about a Vermont subject, is that I'm writing for adults like me. Some people who know me might suggest that I'm not totally as adult as I might be. I used to say that, when I was writing for middle schoolers, it was easier because we were on the same maturity level. But writing for grown-ups, you're writing for people in your world, whereas trying to write for young people, it's always sort of an adventure to try to get there and see what the world through their eyes. Right. And that's a very intense time of life too. It's a time of a lot of change and upheaval and confusion. Being a 7th, 8th grader, almost nobody remembers that as an easy time.
So I'm kind of curious, as you brought it up, is when you were sitting there writing for youth, and now and as we said, like your book now, Catalyst for Change,
right?
The genres are so different, and your stories of like do you write as an author? Do you write the books you want to read, or are you writing the books that you think people are going to want to read?
These are really good questions. I think you need to write the books you would want to write. I mean, that you would want to read. Exactly. I think those are the stories, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, that you're going to get invested in and involved in because you want to read it. Now, I was a big reader as an awkward, strange, ill-fitting adolescent. Books were really important to me. So that was a way that I could connect with writing for young adults as an adult. But I also have a background, as I mentioned, in journalism. I first came to Vermont in the early 80s, and I was the Boston Globe's Montpelier reporter from the mid 80s into the early 90s. And that was my last proper journalism job. But I've been writing for adults ever since as a freelancer, doing work for nonprofits, foundations, some businesses in Vermont, publication work on contract. But my background is in that journalism. So the current book is a work of journalism. And for me, and we can talk more about that, but it was really meaningful and involving to write about Vermont issues and the organizations, nonprofits mostly, that are trying to make positive change in environmental, energy, journalism, healthcare, land conservation. So that was, these are issues that I've cared about and been writing about as a writer ever since the 80s.
Right. That's, what, you just made me you just answered one of my questions. I was going to ask you. I was going to say, when you wrote Catalyst for Change, were you wearing your author hat or your journalist hat?
I don't know that I qualify as a real journalist anymore because it's been a long time. I've been basically a writer for hire for a long time, along with writing these young adult books. But one of the clients, the story behind this book, Catalyst for Change, the subtitle is How Nonprofits and a Foundation Are Helping Shape Vermont's Future. And the story focuses on nonprofits in Vermont. I mentioned the different issue areas. So it covers a number of different complex public issues and how these nonprofits, from the Conservation Law Foundation to Vermont Public Interest Research Group, Trust for Public Land, the University of Vermont, and some others, have addressed those issues. Well, a lot of those nonprofits have been clients of mine over the years. I've written newsletters and annual reports and, fundraising materials, whatever they needed, and nowadays websites. So a lot of the people over the years, in my years being a writer in Vermont, a lot of the people that I've come to really, really admire most are people in these nonprofits who work really hard for not a lot of money, trying to make this state a better place. So the opportunity to write this book came through a foundation called the Lindeloc Foundation, which is a Vermont, a family foundation based in Shelburne, very well known. If you work in environmental, energy, healthcare, especially women's health, journalism, they're a major supporter of nonprofits working in those areas. And they are just, in a couple of years, I think they will be 50 years old. Wow. So I was asked by Cree Lindeloc, who's the director of the foundation, to write the story of the foundation that didn't focus on the foundation itself, but on the nonprofits that they've supported and worked with and how those organizations have been able to make a difference. So it was an opportunity. It was also a job. And I was really grateful to have both of those. And what I've said about this book is that as a journalist or a former journalist, there's no New Yorker magazine in Vermont. There's not even really there's not a Vermont Life anymore. There is not a venue, a publication that will commission a really in-depth look at, for example, one of the chapters in this book is about how can Vermont transition to a clean energy economy. That is a very complicated subject. And I was able through this project to tell that story and where the state is at and how it's gotten there over the last 20 years. Well, there's no publication that will commission you as a journalist to put that story together in real depth. So the opportunity to do that about a number of different really key subjects, not just energy, that was what that book gave me. And so, it was really exciting. And to me, as I said, so many people that I got to write about, I've admired, and I got a chance to really tell their stories, and stories of the groups they work with.
So I'm kind of curious as well, with that said, is there It's almost as if the tone of the book seems to be the inspiration by necessity, like optimism by necessity.
Good. That's good. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Go
was that one of the things as they commissioned your book? Was there a tone that they were requesting to say you have to make sure the book ends like or tells this type of thing?
No. I had worked a little bit with the Lindeloc Foundation before. I'd done an annual report for them. I'd done a presentation for them. So I knew Cree, Lindeloc, her husband Phil they're people who, and now they're grown children who guide the foundation. So I knew Cree and her family a bit. When she asked me to do this book, she's very hands off. She's involved in a lot of these issues. She's in the State House a lot. She sits on the VPIRG board. She's very active and can be outspoken. But for example, the Lindeloc Foundation is a major supporter of V.T. Digger. It's a major supporter of the Vermont edition on VPR, the Vermont This Week program on public television. And I interviewed people in those different programs and V.T. Digger, and what they told me was the Lindelocs don't tell you what they want you to say. They don't interfere with editorial content. They don't propose a slant. They don't react if they don't agree with you. They're just supportive. And my experience was basically like that. Cree said to me, I want this book, I want it not to focus on us, but on the nonprofits and how they've been able to make a difference. And that was basically it. I just went ahead and did it. And she would suggest people I could talk with. She gave some feedback to draft chapters, but she never said, write it this way or take this viewpoint or draw this conclusion at all. So, and I think I wouldn't have been that comfortable if she had. But so it was an ideal project because I just was told to go for it, and I did.
So was there anything that you've kind of discovered on your own as you put this book together that you were surprised about that it hasn't been talked about as much as you would think it would have been?
Well, that's a good question. What am I surprised about? Well, for example, journalism. One of the chapters in this book is called In Pursuit of Truth, which is the motto of V.T. Digger, and I thought made a great chapter title because V.T. Digger is kind of the main character in the chapter about can local and responsible journalism survive in Vermont? And interviewing Anne Galloway, who's the founder and director, leader of V.T. Digger, she talked about, I'm paging through how many journalists we have lost in Vermont over the last, she said, I found the page, she said, when V.T. Digger, she started, I thought, wow, if we had 10 reporters, we could cover everything in the state. This was, V.T. Digger started in 2009. She said, but even with a newsroom larger than that today, we're still not cutting it. We're not covering everything. We're missing 20,000 reporters in this country now. In my state, we're missing 50 reporters. We're not making up the difference. It's not enough. So, and people like me who are old newspaper people or journalists of different venues, we're all really aware that journalism is really struggling. Papers have folded all over the country, big city papers, small papers, and jobs have gone away. And how does democracy survive without a vital, robust journalism? And so one of the major concerns of the foundation has been to help journalism survive and to evolve. Journalism is not, print journalism is not profitable anymore. Local papers sometimes can get by. I live in Middlebury, and the Addison Independent is one of the great papers in the country. It's our weekly paper. But big city papers have folded all over the country because they can't compete with Craigslist. They can't compete with online advertising. So what Anne Galloway told me from V.T. Digger is, I asked her, how can Vermont journalism survive? And she said, well, it's basically got to be nonprofit. It's got to look to fundraising and foundations and individual supporters in ways that other nonprofits do. And if it can do that well, it can survive. So that was a chapter where, I was aware of V.T. Digger. I didn't know they have now the largest newsroom in the state, bigger than Burlington Free Press, bigger than the Valley News, bigger than the electronic media. I had no idea. And I was aware that journalism had struggled. And my old newspaper pals were like, we don't know how can anybody go into journalism today? There don't seem to be the opportunities. What's going to happen? But to get into that story and really report it, I discovered that there are ideas and innovations like this nonprofit news website in Vermont that now has the largest newsroom in the state. That was surprising to me. I didn't realize that. I didn't realize the extent to which VT Digger had become the news source, and especially during the pandemic, they become the go-to news source in the state. That was one area that was really surprising, and obviously close to my own heart.
And did you see anything that, as you're putting this book together, some of these innovations that you've discovered, any of them unique to Vermont culture, or is this something that you've kind of seen that is across the board to other?
So another chapter in the book is about the campaign to close Vermont Yankee. This is called Retiring Vermont Yankee. And Vermont Yankee closed down in 2011, 2012, after about a 20-year campaign by VPIRG and the Citizens Awareness Network down in southern Vermont and a number of other smaller nonprofits to get it to shut down, one of the nation's oldest nuclear power plants. And this is a classic Vermont story because it's very much a David and Goliath story. To me, that's probably the best story in this book, is the campaign to retire Vermont Yankee, which finally did succeed. Vermont Yankee did close in, I think it was early 2012 when they finally did shut down. Wait a minute. No, I'm wrong about that. It was 2016. I think it's 2016. No, 2014. I finally found it. 2014. This is a classic Vermont kind of David and Goliath story. These are VPIRG, for example, the Vermont Public Interest Research Group, which was kind of the lead organization in this very sophisticated campaign that led up to a Vermont State Senate vote in 2010 to oppose the renewal of the Yankees operating license. And that was the first time that had happened in this country, that a legislature had blocked or opposed the renewal of a nuclear power plant's license. So these organizations like VPIRG are up against Entergy, which is a major corporation in the energy business based in I think in Louisiana, that owned Vermont Yankee, that had bought it from Vermont Utilities. And this is a major corporation. And the nuclear power industry is very, very powerful. And so it was really a cool Vermont story because these organizations, they were doing summer, like VPIRG's summer pledge drive, membership drive, going door to door, talking about Vermont Yankee, raising money from individual Vermonters. And they took on this enormous power structure, and they won. It wasn't just the nonprofits. It was also Vermont legislators who took a stand, and in the end, it was partly the economy of the energy industry. All those things kind of came together to convince Energy to shut down Yankee and give it up. But without that campaign, it's doubtful that decision would have been made.
And so, where do you see? You talk about the Lindeloc Foundation, and anybody from Vermont knows them. As you say, you've listened to Vermont PBS or Vermont Public Radio. You're gonna hear them.
You hear the name, yeah.
You hear the name.
Yeah.
Did you have, because and a part of it, you're focusing on the book about the nonprofit sector. Was anything on here where it kind of shows to life as well of like the innovations of small Vermont businesses as well?
Well, yeah. Okay. So the chapter in the book that follows Vermont Yankee and kind of dovetails with it is about the effort to transition from a fossil fuel-based economy in Vermont to a renewable, sustainable energy economy. And the Vermont Yankee story obviously kind of leads into that because Yankee provided a third of our power for, 30 years, I think, and a little bit more. So, the chapter that follows that saga of the Yankee is called Toward a Clean Energy Future. Within this, and this is Toward a Clean Energy Future, I mean, I tried to tell a good story, but this is a complex story to tell because, moving from a fossil fuel economy toward a clean energy economy, obviously we're not all the way there. That that by any means. We've made great strides in the electricity sector, not so much in transportation or home heating of the energy economy in Vermont. But one of the great stories in this grew out of VPIRG, the nonprofit one of the nonprofits working on this effort. Two guys who were VPIRG, part of the VPIRG leadership. One of them was James Moore, who was the director of VPIRG's clean energy campaign, and another guy who's think of his name, Dwayne Peterson, was I think he was president of the board. Dwayne was a political activist, very experienced, from California, who'd moved to Vermont. They saw the opportunity to create a business that would make home solar and small-scale solar really easy to adopt. They came up with a business model and that would, as a homeowner, for example, you wouldn't have to put up any money, but you would end up owning the system. And I could talk about how that works, but basically they created Sun Common, which is a business based in Waterbury now that grew out of VPIRG and then became a profit-making business, which has really made an impact in Vermont. A major part of the home energy solar market in Vermont has been, I think, something like 80%, it's in the book somewhere, has been supplied by Sun Common. So they had this idea. They were both political campaigners. They knew how to put a campaign together, and they decided to take that approach to creating a startup business with this idea of making it very easy and affordable to bring solar into your home, to your small business, to a community project. And Sun Common was a kind of a cool story that is part of that, and has been a model, I think, for others around the country. But that's one business that grew out of this. Catalyst for Change is focused on nonprofits more than businesses. But another one in that story, in that story of the clean energy movement, is how Green Mountain Power became one of the country's leading utilities in innovation that supports, for example, making it possible for you to have a battery system in your home that can store energy and then release it when it's needed. And that's another one of the ways that Green Mountain Power became. They were written up in the New Yorker at one point as being one of the more progressive utilities in the country that was really working to help people make this transition to clean energy.
And I'm kind of curious too, as you're bringing that up. Just recently, there was a report came out that said that, statistically speaking, Vermont is going to have the least impact in global climate change. Do you see the timeliness of this book?
Yeah, the campaign in Vermont, which businesses, nonprofits, civic organizations all over the state in large numbers had supported this movement toward a clean energy economy, played a big role in the final passage and adoption last year of the Global Warming Solutions Act, which Vermont is in the process of figuring out how to enact now. It's a very complicated law whose whole aim is to move us more towards clean energy, and to do it in a way that's equitable, so that less advantaged communities can benefit as much as the wealthier parts of the state, or the wealthier communities. So that's a big achievement that I talk about in the book. And I think that is one example of one thing that kind of comes through in the book that I was aware of and had been aware of ever since my days writing for the Globe, is that Vermont is sort of a laboratory for positive change in this country, partly because we're small, partly because we are fairly sort of progressive. I don't mean that in a really political way. I just mean that Vermonters will try positive, progressive ideas, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in education, whether it's in energy and environment, journalism, a lot of different areas you can point to, and the book does point to, where Vermonters have tried something or introduced an idea that we've been able to try out, field test, make work, and then has been adopted and adapted by larger states and communities around the country. So we're small, but we have had an outsized impact. You could talk about different ways. The catalyst for change starts with the way the Lindeloc Foundation got started in the very early 1970s was by helping to bring the very first hospital-based nurse midwives, two of the very first nurse midwives into the American hospital system in the Burlington Hospital. That was a passion of the founder of the Lindeloc Foundation, Claire Lindeloc, who passed away in 1986. But she was a nurse whose passion was maternity care. And so she saw that there was this emerging demand among women who were going to have babies to be cared for by women. At the time, in the 70s, birthing, labor, and delivery was very much of a male-dominated, medical practice. Obstetricians were mostly male, and women wanted women to care for them, and midwives were usually women, and so Claire Lindeloc worked with the chief of OBGYN at the Burlington Hospital to bring two British nurse midwives onto the hospital staff in the early 70s. And now today, nurse midwifery is very much of a thriving big part of what's now called the Lindeloc Birthing Center at the UVM Medical Center. And nurse midwives are in birthing centers and hospitals all over the state. And that was a really pioneering innovation that helped to make it acceptable and successful to have women actually participate in labor and delivery. And obviously there are female obstetricians at UVM now, as well as at any other places, but that opened up this idea that a different approach to labor and delivery could be provided by nurse midwives, and that's gained acceptance all over the country. So that's another one of the stories of how Vermont kind of pioneered a positive change that has grown and been adopted elsewhere.
And now I'm curious, because there's the amount that you can write about this topic is expansive. Yeah. Did you have to edit it down at all? Do you have like stacks of notes? You're like, I can't fit it in. I have to do a sequel or anything like that?
Yeah. Well, here's something about, so my background combines journalism with fiction writing, and in fiction writing, but also in the work I've done in journalism years ago, I'm interested in stories. I like to read good stories, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, that capture my interest, that I keep reading because I care about the characters, I care about the subject, and I find it to be a good story. So in putting these chapters, each one of them a story in the book together, I was looking for the story, whether it was the story of bringing nurse midwives into the hospital system in America, in Vermont, or whether it was a story of how journalism can adapt to a world where it's not, print journalism is no longer a thriving industry, to how Vermont can adapt to climate change and transform its economy. I was looking for the story to tell, and so that was my sort of way of approaching it. And each one of these stories, especially like the energy chapters, they were really complex. And there was a lot of research. There was a lot of interviewing and gathering of facts and reading of materials and looking at news stories. But in the end, what I looked for was the narrative, the story that there was to tell that was meaningful.
So that's a good point. In order to try to find the story, did that help trying to make complex issues more accessible for the readers?
Yeah, I think so. And, to me, that in this particular book, characters make a story move. You want to be able to identify with the characters. So the main characters in these chapters are these nonprofits and the people at them who've been working on issues like land conservation is another one. Another big area that I haven't talked about, there's a big chapter about, is how do we clean up Lake Champlain? How do we address the cyanobacteria and blue-green algae problem in the lake that is really grown to be a big problem? And it relates to phosphorus emissions from farms, from urban areas, from suburban paved areas, all kinds of areas of the Vermont economy. So it's another complex problem. But for example, in that one, the the Conservation Law Foundation is the major player, and a couple of people at the foundation who've been sort of battling in the courts to get Vermont to face up to this problem. They become sort of the main characters in that story, or some of the main characters. The midwives in the midwifery story, the people at VPIRG in the story about campaigning to close Vermont Yankee. So those characters, those real people, become sort of the heroes of the story. And issues are important, but unless you can humanize them, it's hard to keep people's attention.
So as a researcher, that's a good question. It's a good point. So as a researcher for this, did you first find the topic and then look for the story, or did you have a really good story and say, okay, what is this story about?
Honest to God, that was all the direction I got from was we just want this story to focus on the nonprofits and how they've been able to make a difference. They didn't say focus on midwifery, focus on land conservation, energy, the lake. They just said, go ahead and do it. And so I really started in an open-ended way to say, well, what are the important stories here? So I looked at what were the nonprofits the foundation had supported. I looked at the grant list for almost 50 years, and what were the major themes that jumped out as you looked at those lists? Who did they support and why? What were the projects? What were the efforts that they supported? And so the stories began to come together. And obviously I was aware, for example, of the cyanobacteria problem in the lake, although not really in great detail. I was aware of the campaign to close Vermont Yankee. And so I had some background just as a regular Vermont newsreader, but not a lot in most of these areas. It was all, I had a lot to learn. But so I started in that open-ended way. What are the major stories here that I can develop out of what really happened? There are other projects the foundation has supported. For example, the campaign to end childhood hunger. We just have a photo and a caption that deals with that. We could have done more, but I didn't see it as the same kind of narrative emerging. And people who are passionate about that, I'm sure, would disagree. But so I had to make some of those choices because you couldn't tell every story.
Did you have a point where you probably had so my question for you, as putting on your author hat, asking some questions for authors that might be listening, how was the editing process for this?
Oh, well, I did work with a very, very good copy editor. You need editors, obviously. Right. So we found and worked with a really, really good copy editor in Western Massachusetts who was recommended to me. She had edited Michelle Obama's very successful memoir and a lot of other books. She was really, really good. And so, she gave me copy editors give you really close feedback. That's their job. And they question a lot of things and they check a lot of things or make you check a lot of things. And so, I needed that. These stories, each one of them, each chapter is pretty complex. The bibliography for this book runs to 6,000 words. It's just page after page of articles and books and interviews. And then I worked again toward the end with a proofreader. She's based in, I think, Barrie, also very professional and very good. And each one of those people really put me through the ringer. You need that. You need editors, writers. You're so close to the story that it's hard to see where you might be confusing the reader, or where the gaps in your information might be, or what mistakes you've made, of which I made plenty, believe me. Hopefully they're not still in there, but we caught a lot of stuff that would have been embarrassing, from small things to larger things. But that's what the editor's job is.
How was your process? I'm kind of curious about this. How was your process putting this book together as compared to your previous book, The Street of Storytellers?
So, nonfiction and fiction are different for me. For example, one of my young adult novels, before Street of Storytellers, I counted something like 24 drafts, and that with fiction, that is necessary, at least for me, because the characters and the story develops from just really a sketch in your first draft. They develop and evolve from draft to draft in ways that you probably are going to be surprised by. And that's sort of a natural process because you're creating something, Whereas with nonfiction, it's not that it's not challenging, but for me, I found that the research was the most challenging part. When it came to the writing, finding that story among that mountain of material was not easy, but it didn't take 24 drafts, It's more a matter of finding the story and writing it, and then, working to improve the writing and refine the writing. But there's not the same evolutionary draft by draft by draft by draft process for me that there is in fiction. And I think that's probably fairly, and I don't want to minimize the challenge of writing nonfiction at all. I just think it's a little different.
Right. And so what's next for you, Dan?
Well, right now, Barney, I'm finishing another book that it's a nonfiction book that is a history of the community college of Vermont.
Okay.
This is a tremendous Vermont story. Somebody told me when I got started that there are two ideas that grew up in the late 60s in Vermont, two sort of projects or undertakings that survived and thrive today. One of them is CCV, and the other is VPR, Vermont Public Radio. CCV grew out of, I think the first classes were offered for free. Teachers were unpaid in 1971, I think, or 70. No, I think it was 72. And the idea was because Vermont has such a widely dispersed rural population, you couldn't build one community college and have it be accessible to everybody, especially in rural areas all over the state. So much rural poverty, people couldn't travel from Barton, Vermont to, say, Randolph in the center, where Vermont Tech is, to go to a community college. So instead, the community college would be a new kind of community college that is based in the communities, taught by people in the communities, people teaching things that they know, whether it would be law or I could teach writing or accounting or any number of things. And it was initially non-degree, completely free, and kind of very much looked down on by the real colleges in Vermont. But over the years, Vermont CCV began offering associate degrees, and while they remained very focused on meeting students where they are, there is a CCV Learning Center. There are 12 of them around the state, within 25 miles of 95% of people in Vermont. And then there's the Online Learning Center, which is a huge part of CCV today. So you can go to college without leaving your home. And so CCVs had to be very, very innovative. They were one of the first colleges to adopt online courses in the late 90s, when that was very, very new and different. They were one of the first colleges to create a dispersed kind of a virtual online library, because that was what they had to do. And they've managed to remain this sort of student-centered, very, very flexible, very innovative and creative college over all these years, as they've become much more of a mature and respected college. Today, they have the second largest student population in Vermont, second only to UVM. So it's a wonderful story, and it's a creativity, innovation, and giving people a chance to get higher education that would never otherwise have it. People in rural poor, especially, and urban poor, but people all over the state who have had a chance at college. Originally, they were all adults, and now about half of CCV students are traditional age college students. So it is a great story, and I'm finishing it up. I'm close to the end of writing it, and I've been working on it for a couple of years, and it's a great project.
That's amazing. You're just as passionate about that you are about your other book too.
Oh yeah, I really like this story. This is a great story, and it, for me, the chance to tell a positive story about Vermont, which a state I've lived in since the early 80s and really love and admire so many people who've done really positive, meaningful things. in this case in higher education, it really, we are seeing so much, obviously so much hatred and division in this country, polarization in this country. And you read so much bad news and depressing news, and it's hard not to think, is everything falling apart? Is there any hope? And so these two, this story is really a series of stories of hope, of people working really hard over long periods of time and making positive change happen. And so, yeah, for me, that's what I'm really grateful to be able to tell some of these stories right now.
So if somebody wants to find your book and somebody wants to read more of your books, what would be the best place that they could go?
Well, these books like A Catalyst for Change just came out 2 weeks ago. So
Right.
It's available on any online outlet, or hopefully your local bookstore. If they don't have it in stock, it is brand new. They can certainly get it. So it's available wherever books are sold, as we say. It's brand new. So whether it's going to be in stock, it is distributed by Ingram, a major distributor. And so, anybody who wants it any bookstore who wants it can get it, and any individual can get it.
That's right. It was released in March 29th, 2022.
Right.
Yeah.
March 29th. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. When your book comes out, it's always got a publication date. And at first, when you kind of expect fireworks and celebrations, and after a while you realize it's just another day. It's just a day when the bookstores and the libraries can actually order it, or if you're going on Amazon or another online site, when you can actually order it. That's
Right.
just what it means. But it's kind of a cool thing anyway to have that day come.
Right. And then you have your DougWilhelm.com. Is that a good spot?
Yeah. Yeah. I have my website, and that's still focused on Street of Storytellers and my young adult stuff. I haven't put up, we need to put Catalyst for Change up there.
Right.
But yeah, yep. The young adult novels were really my work for years and years. And Street of Storytellers is what number 17. You and I mentioned before we went on the air that I wrote, I think it was 11 books for the Choose Your Own Adventure series. That's how I got started. And then after that, I moved on to just regular middle school and YA fiction. So that's what, like, my website is still devoted to. The books. There was one book I had called The Revealers, that a story about middle school bullying that over 1,000 schools have worked with, mostly with All School Reads around the country. So a lot of the website is devoted to what schools have done with that book, materials they've developed, projects they've done, how other schools can pick up on that. So that was really my work for years. And now moving on to the adult nonfiction, it's a nice change, but I really still do school visits and talk with young people, and I still really enjoy that.
Wow. Well, great. So we're at the top of the hour already, Doug. So I told you it'd go by fast.
Yeah, it went by fast. That's because I talk so much.
Well, you know what you need to do? You need to come back on the show
Okay.
and talk about your next book about CCV. So
yeah. I don't have a publication date. I think we have a publisher, but we're not at the point of signing, so I can't say for sure. But I hope we'll get that out next year. That would be my hope, because it's a terrific story. But so I'd love to come back on. Thanks, Barney.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you very much, Doug.
Yeah, it was really fun, and it was great questions, really interesting questions. Thanks for having me on this. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Have you never heard of the Wilhelm Scream?
Oh yes, I have. And there was a band not long ago called the Wilhelm Scream. Yeah.
There was I think it was that every Star Wars movie they try to put in a Wilhelm Scream on it.
It was originally, you can find the original clip. It was a sort of a cheesy Western, and Wilhelm was like a trooper, and his sergeant calls out to him, "Wilhelm, be careful!" And then Wilhelm is shot, and he goes, "Ah!" as he falls. I can't do it, but it's been used about like hundreds of times in movies. That was
Right.
way back, like in the 30s, I think, or maybe later. But it was an old movie. It's been used so many times since then. I didn't know what the Wilhelm Scream was when there was a band called the Wilhelm Scream. I heard of it. I thought, why are they called that? And then I went on Wikipedia, looked it up, and so